Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Doherty, co-founder of the Doherty Relationship Institute, and I'm here to do a brief overview of the family Firo model, which is an approach that I have used since the 1970s in my own therapy work, and found it extremely useful, and for a whole bunch of different reasons that I'll share here. I want to say where it came from. Back in the 1970s, a lot of us were studying group dynamics at the same time as we were studying family dynamics. And nobody had told me this unwritten rule that you shouldn't ever put those together, that families are completely separate. Families are out of the psychotherapy world, the therapy world, and that group dynamics, group formation was a different thing. But for me, I saw, hey, families are groups, couples are the smallest group, there can be ideas that can cross-fertilize. So I came across the Firo model developed by Will Schutz, which is one of a number of different models for organizing a way to think about group development. Those categories are inclusion, control, and affection is what Schutz called them. The formation stage of a group, who's in or who's out, what are the norms of the group, do they have a mission? Do they know who are the members? Do they have some clarity of leadership? And to the extent to which a group is able to master that developmental stage of a group, they're able to handle control issues, which relates to disagreements, conflicts, those sorts of pressures that come up in all groups. With the idea being, if you're not sure who's in and out of the group, you're not sure what the mission is, you're not sure who the leaders are, you can't really effectively resolve control issues. And so the group ends up floundering. And then affection is the third stage in the group development, which is when you get really close interpersonal bonding between group members. So you have an effective group and you have good personal relationships. And the idea there in group theory is that if you have raging control struggles, you're not going to have the kind of safety for vulnerability, for really openness, for spontaneous personal interactions. So you may have heard versions of this on the lines of Norman, Storman, and Performan in groups. You get the norms of a group, you know who you are and so on. And then you go through a phase when you argue and fight, and that's the Storman. You get through all of those and you perform. And people feel proud to be part of the group. So lots of different models of group development that have similar stages. I thought that is pretty cool, because what it helped me with is, how do you prioritize treatment for families, for multi-dimensional, multi-conflict families, multi-problem couples, when you have problems in lots of different dimensions? Maybe when the people come in with conflict, it's being fed by some prior inclusion issues that haven't been dealt with. And when people come in wanting more intimacy, maybe the issue is that they have these raging control struggles, which are in turn fed by those inclusion issues. And so what it told me was, hey, maybe there's a way to set priorities in treating couples and families. So that's how I got started. And over time, developed some publications, fleshed this out, decided it had to be adapted to families and couples, because we're not, groups of strangers just coming together. And along with my colleague, Nick Colangelo, as I was developing this, we made a pilgrimage to meet with Will Schutz and showed him our work and got his blessing for an adaptation of the Firo. Firo stands for Fundamental Interpersonal Relations Orientation, by the way, and an adaptation for families and couples. And so we did some shifting because of these more intimate relationships. So I want to briefly go over the whole thing with you, and tell you why I think it can be extremely helpful in your work with couples. So the first thing I want to do is to go over what are the concepts in this, which can help you assess couple relationships in many dimensions, more dimensions than in some other ways of assessing couples. So the three categories are inclusion, control, and intimacy. So we changed affection to intimacy for this approach. So inclusion, control, and intimacy. And inclusion relates to interactions that relate to bonding and organization. And so the categories are structure, who's in and who's out of the membership in the family, what are the boundaries, are there generational boundaries that are working and not, what kinds of roles are people playing? And so structure, connectedness, which has to do with nurturance, involvement, commitment, sense of belonging, affiliation. And so this is the kind of emotional bonding and commitment part of a couple's relationship. And then shared meaning is their sense of identity as a couple, a we. How are we a we? Loyalty to one another, and rituals that they develop, values that they have, their worldview. So what kind of shared meaning do we have as a couple as we go through our lives? So inclusion, then control. Control is about the dimension of the couple relationship that relates to influence and power during conflict. So control is about conflict. And there the categories are dominating patterns. So you coerce, you manipulate, you dictate. Reactive, which is rebellion, submission, counter manipulation, withdrawal. So a sort of aggressive, passive aggressive, if you will, sometimes with just withdrawing. And collaborative, which is what we're aiming for. Where you can, both people can negotiate, they can do compromise, they can balance, they can do sharing. So inclusion, control, and then intimacy are interactions that relate to open disclosure and close personal exchanges. So mutual sharings of feelings, relating to another's unique personalities, emotionally close sexual interactions, sharing vulnerabilities. So the really kind of deep, rich part of a couple's relationship is the intimacy domain. So what these represent then is a multidimensional way to think about interactions in a couple. And I want to be clear, this is about interactions. This is about how people relate to each other. This is not intrapsychic. This is interactional. And in fact, people come to us not for their intrapsychic problems for couples therapy. They come because they want to get along better. And so this relates to how they get along and how they interact with each other. I want to point out that in the development of this model, one of the things that we decided to do was to take something like what we call in our field attachment and say it really belongs in two different places here. So we're distinguishing between the attachment that is about bonding, nurturance, commitment, belonging, okay, if you will, feeling loved and loving somebody, and then intimacy, which you could say is another form of attachment that relates to these deep, vulnerable exchanges, which are really not that common. They happen occasionally with couples. And so one of the advantages of distinguishing between the core attachment, the core bonding, in the sense of, we care about each other, we have each other's back, and intimacy is that without the first one, without the sense of, hey, we're a couple, we're committed to each other, we care for each other, you can't manage, according to this way of thinking, you have trouble managing conflict because there's something, you don't feel like you're a couple, you don't feel married. And that intimacy, this more kind of psychological closeness, the sharing of one's deeper self, is actually, in this way of thinking, a more rarefied experience. It's sort of the top of the mountain, if you will, and that in fact, there are couples, certainly traditional couples throughout most of history, probably had very little of what we now call in the psychological era intimacy. And then in fact, you can have a good marriage, just so you can have a good family, you can have good, say, adult child relationships, even older adults and their adult children. You can have a sense of being family, of loving one another, getting along with each other, managing conflict okay, and actually not have that much in the way of sharing of one's deeper self. So we think it's important for assessing couples as well as families to distinguish between the attachment connectedness. That's what we're calling connectedness. So we're not using the word attachment because it's used in the field and it can convey too many things to different people. But if you will, an attachment connectedness, okay, versus intimacy attachment. So we think that this is actually a very important distinction. And one of the implications of this model is that if you try too quickly for intimacy, when you have problems in the control domain and in turn problems in the inclusion domain, you may be able to get some temporary intimate disclosures in therapy with the therapist sort of creating the environment for that, creating the safety for that, but it's not going to translate to home. So these are the core concepts in this, and the biggest payoff. So I always think, well, why should anybody learn a new model here? Okay, a new way to think about to think about couple relationships. There's plenty of models out there. This one suggests priorities for treatment, which is a big challenge for therapists. You got couple with escalating arguments, they got money problems, they have in-law problems, they don't spend enough time together, they certainly aren't relating intimately, maybe they've stopped having sex. Where do you go with all this sort of stuff? What I've learned is that many therapists do not have a theory-driven way to think about where you prioritize with multi-problem couples. And the mistake can be, you start with intimacy because that's where you may want to end up. And they can't manage it because they have these control struggles going on. And then if they have these control struggles, this dominating reactive control struggles, it may be, and according to this way of thinking, that these are fed by, that there's a bleeding over of, let's say, a lack of time together, a lack of shared meaning about how they're going to do their lives together, how they look at structure, how they're going to do, how they do boundaries, how they organize themselves. That there's all kinds of ways in which, if they're not bonded, have a sense of shared meaning, if their roles are ambiguous, that they are going to, those inclusion issues are going to bleed into control struggles, which again are going to make intimacy nearly impossible. So the priority sequence in the family Firo model is inclusion before control, control before intimacy. So you just don't start with, let me help this couple with better conflict resolution abilities. That's important. As if being able to handle conflict better when they're not seeing each other, or when somebody isn't committed to the relationship, that's not going to do it. So let's take the commitment issue, which is part of inclusion. If somebody is not sure they want to stay in the marriage, in the relationship, you have to start there. You have to start there. You have to help them see whether they're in or out. Because the fundamental thing with inclusion is, am I in or out? Am I here for the duration here, at least to work through these issues? Or am I on the brink? Same way, if there's an active affair going on, you have a fundamental problem of who's in the marriage. You have a third party in the marriage. Similarly, you have family of origin loyalty struggles. You have co-parenting challenges. Let's say in step families, where you have a lack of a shared meaning about what kind of family they are and who's going to manage what part of parenting. When you have those sorts of issues going on, those are inclusion issues, and then they're going to create lots of control struggles. And so in this model, you always look for how inclusion, working on those issues, can help eliminate the need for a lot of conflict, eliminate the need for people to use their highest level of conflict skills. So multidimensional assessment, priority setting, attachment, existing in two different places where you have to prioritize the bonding attachment, the other intimacy attachment, may or may not come depending on the couple. And so the next thing is that this model can help us understand family developmental changes. family developmental changes, because what it suggests is that when you have, say, a change in membership in the family household, in the couple's household, that they're going to have to, so you have a new child come, you have a kid leave home, maybe after all the kids leave home, aging parent moves in, you have a change in household composition in the couple's life. What this model suggests is that they're going to have to redo inclusion. They're going to have to figure out their roles, their boundaries, who's in and who's out of the family in what way. They're going to have to figure out how they're going to do connection similarly and differently. And then this idea, okay, what are we now? Are we a couple who were co-parents all these years, or to what extent are we a couple? Who are we? What's the meaning of our relationship? What's going to happen to our rituals? And so couples continually have to recycle. They may have actually settled in pretty well in terms of this inclusion, control, intimacy, and now bang, something shifts. And that, just like in a group, you have new members come in, old members leave a group, or the mission of the group shifts, and the group is going to have to recycle through inclusion, control, and intimacy. So it's a way to think about how couple relationships are ever changing, and you never just sort of settle somewhere. And that there's a normal process of redefining ourselves. And as a therapist, you can normalize some of this and help people see that the challenges that they're facing, which usually come up in the sense of not being connected, having lots of arguments that aren't resolved, not feeling intimate anymore, that these are in part a function of perhaps a not well cycled, not recycling through inclusion, control, and intimacy in a way that can be helpful. So this family Firo model then can help us understand, and we can help couples understand the kind of normal challenges that sometimes they get stuck on and that they come in to see us, as opposed to the idea that they were fatally flawed from the beginning. You can have a couple that's doing pretty well, and then there's a change in membership, or there's a change in somebody has a serious chronic medical illness, and you have external systems now, medical people. I worked with a couple that had a child with a serious illness, and they had 13 doctors working with it. And so the boundaries of the families start to get blurred. Families in welfare, in the social service system, couples who are dealing with that as well, their boundaries, the structure has to be figured out, and as well as their connectedness and shared meaning. So, so the next part of this model, because I think it has many implications, is that our models of couples therapy tend to emphasize different domains of this family Firo model. And so, and this is going to perhaps oversimplify, because many therapists deal with all of these domains, but there's a way in which there's sort of a specialization that occurs. If so, more, say, psychodynamically oriented, more intrapsychic oriented therapy models of couples therapy really emphasize the intimacy domain. Because they're looking for deep self-knowledge and for being able to share vulnerabilities. Behavioral models, cognitive behavioral models, tend to have a particular emphasis on the control domain, because they're helping people learn to negotiate with each other, Attachment-oriented models, of course, can handle lots of this. However, there's a strong emphasis of helping people really go deep into their psychological challenges from the past, and to have deep self-revelations to each other. And that's the intimacy domain, and it can be quite beautiful. The best of those models also, of course, deal with control issues, because they want to have enough safety for intimacy to occur. When I first developed this model, I analyzed various family therapy models in terms of how they emphasize this as well. So structural family therapy emphasizes first inclusion, the structures, the bonding, the boundaries, and then control. Did not do much with intimacy. And so you can, with the family Firo model, you can do a kind of mindful theory-based integration or eclecticism, or the use of concepts and tools that come from different models of therapy, depending on what's needed for the particular couple at the particular moment. And what it suggests is you don't use some techniques like intimacy-oriented techniques in the presence of these control struggles that make it unsafe, and that you always go back and look at those inclusion issues and which models can help the couple. So maybe they need to create the rituals so that they begin to connect with each other. Some very basic sorts of things. So for example, a couple who worked with a couple once where the only time they saw each other, working different shifts, was in my office. And of course, and they had lots of raging control struggles. And so I did some kind of helping them restructure using some psychoeducational approaches to help them understand how they could create some spaces in their life where they actually were connected to each other, because it wasn't going to be enough in my office. With step families and remarried families, couples in step families, this model is particularly useful because they come in because they're fighting, they're arguing, they're not feeling intimate anymore. And so many of the challenges in step families relate to co-parenting in a complex family system. And so maybe your kids and my kids and our kids, and who's parenting who and who's got more authority. And then you have your exes, and then you have grandparents, and, on all sides. And you have these very complex step families where there is often a lack of shared understanding, a shared meaning and agreement about how are we doing this? Is there a primary and secondary parent, for example? And the research suggests that the original parent needs to be the primary lead, and that the step parent needs to be a backup and consultant, if you will, and work on bonding with the children before trying to get into a lot of the control and discipline. So there's a lot of research on that, a lot of clinical wisdom on that, and the family Firo model can be used to help this couple, again, in a kind of psychoeducational way in the inclusion domain, to understand which roles tend to work and which ones tend not to work. And so it tends not to work for the original parent to be working all the time, and the step parent is trying to manage the kids. Step parent doesn't have the bonding, the inclusion part of this, and the kids usually won't let them discipline, which is the control area. And of course, the couple is going to have very little intimacy. So what I'm giving this as an indication of how this family Firo model can help figure out which kinds of tools to use, depending on what issue the family is dealing with. And finally, since the family Firo model came out of group theory, it can also be applied to how we think about the clinical system that consists of the therapist and the couple. The same techniques, the same concepts, and some of the same techniques, but the same concepts apply there, that we are a group in formation when we begin, and that we have to establish an inclusion stage. What are we here for? So what are the goals? What can I do for them? Who's leading the sessions? So that what are our roles here? What's the structure? What kind? We have to establish connection with each party. This is the therapeutic alliance. And we need to develop a shared meaning about both goals and about how, as the therapist, you're going to work with folks. Powerful stuff that has to begin early, the inclusion phase of couples therapy. And we place a big emphasis on this in the Doherty approach, where we talk about getting traction, if you will, getting traction is this small group now, the couple and the therapist, managing to create a structure, a connection, and a shared understanding of what the goals are and the approach that the therapist is going to take, and who's initiating what. Without that, what happens is in the therapeutic system, we get into control struggles. We get into the one or both spouses saying this, the therapist doesn't understand me, this isn't working, why are we taking this approach and not that approach? You get into these sorts of power struggles and withdrawals. So somebody may get aggressive, somebody withdraws, and it's important for the therapist to develop collaborative ways of managing that conflict. It can happen with any couple, of course, but it's the control struggles in couples therapy with the therapist and the couple are apt to be based on the inclusion stage not having been well handled. Now, the intimacy stage, then, if all of that's happening, so inclusion and we manage any control and conflict, well, then there's the opportunity for the couple to experience intimacy with each other in the room, and even occasionally these sort of beautiful moments that happen with the therapist, where there's often maybe when you're kind of teary, something's beautiful happening with them and you feel a heart connection with them. And there can be these moments of intimacy, if you will, in the therapeutic system when the control issues are not being front and center. And again, that's based on the inclusion issues. So it's a way of working and a way of thinking that I have found very useful over the years as a guide to a multidimensional way of assessing what's going on with couples. And we have a whole set of tools about how you assess based on these categories. Priority setting, which is really huge. Where do we go? How do we set priorities when they come in with 4 or 5 different problems? And I gave you an example, really an obvious example. If there's a commitment issue, that's gotta be on the table. And there's many others. A way to understand the developmental process, the transitions that couples go through, and to be able to normalize them and help them understand those. A way to be eclectic or integrative and to use concepts and tools from different models based on a theory of what those models do best. And then how to assess our relationship in the room, my relationship with the couple, using the same categories and again, the same sense of priorities as we go about troubleshooting and problem solving so that we get traction. We have a group that functions well for the couple in accomplishing their goals. So that's a quick tour. It's fundamental to the Doherty approach. Lots of ways that we'll be talking about this in the future for those who are on board for this journey of the Doherty approach. And I have enjoyed telling you about it.